Hey folks, it's Claire. Before we get started, I have a correction to make. In the previous episode, I said that Albertus Magnus College was founded in 1924. I was mistaken. The Dominican Sisters bought the property in 24, but the charter was signed on July 13th of 1925. Management regrets the error. Those responsible have been sacked. Welcome to Transqat. I'm Claire McCarthy. When you and I were talking at the TCNE event in Boston, you had a quote that just hooked my heart, where you said, "We're good fish, we're just swimming in toxic waters." Give me a little idea of what you meant by that.
Of course, absolutely. To give you a little background on that, one of my dear friends was a professor at Lesley University. I can't remember the exact location, but there was literal pollution in the water, and there were actually animals getting sick, and people in the area were getting sick. I forget which, because it's so long ago now. We're going back like to 2018 now, so forgive me for not remembering the exact location, because capitalism, they do this everywhere. But it just made me think, I'm like, this applies to everywhere. And she made that reference too. It's like, ultimately, this applies to systems too. We're good fish, we're swimming in toxic water. So I want to give her credit for that, because that's something that she applied. And so the way that she meant it, I kind of wanted to expand on it, was that when we're swimming in toxicity, when we're talking about systems of oppression that we're living in, it's easy for us to internalize that when we're just soaking up in that toxicity all day. When we're living in a world full of transphobia, when we're living in a world full of homophobia, when we're living in a world full of sexism or transmisogyny, racism, anti-Blackness, I mean, you name it, and you're just living in it. And just everywhere you go, school, home, you can't turn on the television, you can't scroll through your phone and not see it. You're just living in it. It's so hard not to internalize it if it's just everywhere. It's very easy to start believing that you are bad. And it helps, that quote really helps us kind of step back and realize, like, actually, the system is bad. You're not bad. How you're being treated is bad. You're not bad. The system is bad. You don't need to go away. The system needs to be dismantled. So it helps to take a step back and start thinking about how to organize and how to make change, rather than thinking like, oh, I need to either end my life or I need to isolate. I mean, it really was just a shifting moment when she showed those pictures of pollution and made the reference to fish, being like, we're good fish. Because it made us think like we are swimming in toxic waters every day. So I really like to make that reference everywhere I go, because it really just makes people take a minute to step back and realize, like, it applies to even day-to-day situations, even if we're not talking about systemic things. So when I talk to my students and they're, bringing up situations that are going on at home, or they're bringing up situations that are going on with their partners, and they're telling me that they're not being heard maybe by a parent, I'm like, you know what? I'm hearing that you're a good fish. You're swimming in toxic water. It sounds like your parents aren't listening to you. They're not respecting your pronouns. They're not respecting your gender identity. I'm like, I'm hearing that you're a good fish. You're swimming in toxic water. It sounds like your boyfriend's disrespecting you. So it really can apply to so many different things. And it really shows you that the majority of the world, I don't think, is actually bad people. I think it's systems that make us think we're bad.
One of the pieces of follow-up that I think you said that at the time is that you can't blame the fish for the quality of the water.
You can't.
And so not only when you're immersed in this just nonstop barrage of systemic hostility, of course you're going to internalize that. But to realize that that is fixable and that it is not your fault is very important. Well, Mateo Rojas, welcome to Transqat. I'm so glad we got a chance to do this, because the January event, 5 minutes, was just not even remotely enough for the conversation I wanted to have with you. You identify as a trans man. He, him pronouns?
Yes.
Okay.
Yep. He, him, his.
Can you just give us a little sense of that journey for you? When did you first start thinking about this issue? I know you had said you came out just shortly after college.
So it was one of those things where, growing up, it's so funny. You just look back at old pictures and you just see the trans boy energy basically in every photo. And it's funny because the parents will look back and like, oh, I see no signs. I'm like, really? Because it's screaming, I mean, even as far back as 1996, like the backwards hat and the overall. I mean, it's really funny. But ultimately, what it comes down to is I didn't have a name for what I was experiencing. And that was gender dysphoria, and that was being part of the trans community, which is why actually I was one of the speakers at this event. What I talked about was that it's important that we name these things for children because when we deny access of names to kids, we deny access to community. I really wish somebody just talks about trans issues with me as a kid. Like, no, this is what it means to be transgender, and that they didn't steer away from it like it was a taboo topic. I mean, often was as I was a kid, anything that was considered queer was considered, quote, inappropriate. Anything that was straight and cis was appropriate. Anything that other than that was inappropriate and very actively and aggressively denied. Because I think that, to be honest, people picked up on it and they were terrified of me finding out. Because I'm Jewish now. I converted and Reformed Jewish, which is very LGBTQ friendly for Reform. But I was raised Catholic and I'm adopted by Irish Catholics. They knew I was bi, and like that was enough to stir up the family. And yeah, it was a very, very intense time growing up. So I kind of went to this phase of like, and I use the phase not in the way of like, oh, I went through a trans phase, more so that like I was dressing very masculine. And eventually, as I was getting older, my parents were like, okay, like, like you're in middle school now, you got to start dressing feminine, you got to start fitting in, the typical narrative that a lot of trans men actually get, that now you're growing up, you got to dress like a girl. So
Right.
I tried and I just could not do it. You look at photos and it's just you cringe. It's like, oh, I tried, but I just could not do the thing.
The again, the
Um,
pictures just
oh, it screams
that
at you.
level of discomfort of
Yes.
distress it's just
Yeah, the
so
distress.
obvious in pictures.
It is. It really is. But I'm also autistic, and they thought it was just like if I was crying, that it was the sensory distress of the dress, and that was a big part of it, like all the frou frou stuff, really frou frou, and how it felt in my body. But I didn't realize like it was also gender dysphoria, meltdowns every single time I'd go to the dressing room with my mom, dysphoria. I just wish I had a name for what I was experiencing. So it wasn't like I had this big realization in college. It was more so that it was finally I had a name for it because when I finally went to college, I had access to GSAs. I could finally go where I wasn't being policed or steered away from going. I could finally go do my own thing. So I'm kind of skipping ahead of a few steps. I'm kind of going back and forth for a reason. But when I went to college, I became vice president of the GSA, and the president was a trans man. And we were doing a lot of lessons on gender dysphoria because we had a lot of cis people, including me, who identified as cis at the time. And it was funny because I was sitting up there and I was like, "Hey, that sounds like me," but I kept like talking myself out. I'm like, "No, that's not me." And then I was like, "Oh, that sounds like me." "Oh, no, that's not me." And so like literally, this is like a whole thing throughout the whole year. I'm like, "Okay, this is me." And I kind of had that panic of like, and now it means I have to do something because now that I know, I can't live like this for the rest of my life. It feels like I had a rock in my shoe my whole life. And
Yeah.
now I had an option to take this rock out of my shoe, and that there's a whole community of people like me, and that there's a solution. But unfortunately, that means that now I'm going to deal with a lot of shit from the world.
Yeah.
But I could now finally be in my own body and be comfortable. Like this was an option, and that I wasn't alone in what I was dealing with because I would talk to the president and talk to other members, and it was just, I felt like I was drowning my whole life and suffocating, and I just finally could breathe in that room. So it was really just an empowering experience of how much GSAs can really do and why it's so important to have queer spaces, because finally when you have access to language to name things, that's enough. And that's why I get so mad when people say, oh, when you send kids to GSAs or queer spaces and they come out gay, it's like, no, they already were
Right.
our whole lives, we just now have a name for it. So no, I didn't. My parents tried that too. You went to the GSA, they turned you trans. It's like, no, no, they didn't. Nope. If you look back as far back as like when I was 1 years old, you see it.
And you're right in saying that there's this balance of relief in that, okay, now I have a language to express what's going on inside, and I can articulate that to others. I can wrestle with that myself. But at the same time, yeah, it means I'm going to have to do something. I'm going to have to
Yeah.
make some changes, and that's scary.
It was very scary. I adopted and I have contact with both families. So I had to come out to an indigenous family in the middle of Paraguay, living in the middle of nowhere, who had unfortunately just become Christians because it was a Portuguese priest that was not minding his business, of course, because when any priest sees in South America sees an indigenous community living like minding their own business, like, oh, let me go colonize them. And
Hmm.
unfortunately, like a year before it came out, he's like, have you heard about Jesus? And yeah, also trans people. So of course, like if it was just like one more year, maybe they would have accepted me. But then I had to come out to my Irish Catholic family. I just could not do it at the time. I was so nervous. I was kind of doing the whole closeted thing for a bit. I was kind of wanting to make sure I was really sure, but also like at the same time, I knew. But I also was dating a cisgender heterosexual man. I was like, okay, he needs to be like the first person that knows because I want to be fair. And I said to him, I understand if you have to break up because it's not your sexuality, but do not tell anybody. And he's like, no, I won't. And of course, within 24 hours, he outed me to 41 people.
Oh, I'm so
41
sorry.
people, you heard me right,
Oh.
41 people, because he went to a July 4th event the next day and he was calling people. He was screaming so loudly on the beach about it that another person who wasn't even with him texted me and said, hey, I support you, but just so you know, he just heavily outed you because he went with a big group of 41 people. So everybody was texting me, and it was a big mix of things. I mean, some people were like, is this a rumor? Is he joking? And other people were like, hey, I support you. What's your name? I'm like, I haven't even decided, because I was doing the thing that a lot of trans men were like, it's a real pipeline. It's like, oh, is it like they, them? And then it's like he, they. And I was still in that pipeline of like getting further into.
But that's it. That's it. It's a journey of discovery, and
Yeah, I wasn't ready yet.
well,
So I had to kind of decide overnight, and it's hard, but not that it's ever like a decision, but I kind of had to be like, all right, what am I going to tell people? Because I wasn't, I even told James, like, I'm not really sure yet, but I had so many people ask, what's your name? What's your pronouns? Like, so it became hard. So I already, luckily, was already thinking about it, and I was already kind of pretty much 99% sure. So I said, okay, it's Mateo, and I'm going to go with he, him. And so it was hard because now I was living a dual life because with a large group of friends, I was Mateo, but with my parents, I was my dead name, and other people, I was my dead name. So I started wearing my hair up with a hat. And then, like, I still was getting frustrated because obviously I was getting misgendered. Like, that's not enough to have people perceive me differently, but I wanted it so badly. So at this point, I started experimenting more with like wearing masculine clothes, like going to Savers, trying things on, going to Macy's, trying things on. And then I realized it just felt so right because I mean, I was wearing masculine clothes when I was like a preteen before I was forced to wear really feminine things, again. But then once it was like on my body, I was really wearing like suits and ties for the first time. I was like, I can't go back. And so going back home was really hard because now I'm just like, I can't, what do I do? Like I can't, I just felt anything. I wanted to rip my skin off. I wanted to rip any clothes off. I mean, I did. I had a whole breakdown where I ripped like my whole hangers down and just cried. I was like,
mm,
I've been outed. I wasn't ready. And now, like, I have to do something because I can't live a dual life. It's making it even harder in the closet. Literally, I feel like I was in the closet, just ripping things up. Like, what do I do now? But I just graduated from college as well. So I was like, okay, now I'm job searching. Do I, come out as trans now and have a harder time finding a job, or do I find a job that accepts me? Like, which one do I do? Because I plan on working with young people, and I want to make sure, like, is it gonna be harder for them to get used to my name, or to go on with my new name? So there was that. I knew I had to move soon. I was like, do I find a safe place to go, or do I have an easier time getting in the place and then just like fight there? I mean, I was just going back and forth with everything, with all angles. My adoptive family always told my adoption story to me and my brother growing up, and they're like, we always wanted a girl and we wanted a boy, and I felt bad about being like sick. But now, though, I mean, I unfortunately lost all three of my best friends, and I don't mean like lost as in they walked away. I mean, as in they all passed away in the last 3 years, and it was really awful.
oh, I'm so
My whole
sorry.
friends were passing away, so now my relationship with the whole, like my parents being butthurt about my gender has really gone down to zero. It's kind of like, you know what, you have two kids that are alive. You really shouldn't be acting like you're grieving over a kid that's alive. When I've seen the parents of my friends who are,
Legitimately
so
grieving.
yeah, it just changes you. It makes you think like, I really shouldn't have compassion for my parents being like, oh, we wanted a girl and now you killed the girl. It's like, things like that.
Uh,
A lot
I
of
think there's a time frame for that as well. You want to be understanding for the people you care about. That you're throwing them this new information, but there's a window after which you're not being
right,
supportive.
absolutely.
You know.
Right. And I understand that, I'm thinking about these things for a long time. I mean, specifically trans stuff where I had a name for it was a short period of time, but really I understood my gender for a long time. I just finally had a name for it. Whereas my parents, like, that is new to them because they weren't thinking about it. They just thought, oh, tomboy. So like it was a big change for them. So I did give them a period of, I'm like, okay, I let you name me for 2 years. Like, let's get with the picture. After a while I put my foot down, I'm like, enough's enough. I'm on T. You're now outing me when I'm public. That's dangerous. I had to put my foot down about it. Not that it's ever okay to out somebody in public, but I'm like, at this point, like, you are making people pick up on it, and in the wrong place. I was in Florida when they were doing it. No, but it was very scary, especially with what my parents had put me through regarding being bisexual. I mean, even that was enough to stir up the town I grew up in. I mean, I'm indigenous, and I grew up in a very white town. It was like 97% white. Everybody was very like Catholic. Everybody was very straight and cis and het. And it was a big deal even with that. I mean, I was forced to get blood tests to rule out I kid you not, quote, what my early cause of homosexual motivation was.
Now,
Because they wanted to see if any homo, like if any hormones were causing my gayness.
Now this was something you mentioned in Boston. So
2007.
they were looking at hormone levels to see if that determined sexual orientation.
So they were looking for something called, it was, what would they call it? Congenital hyperplasia, if I remember correctly, the name that they were looking for. They were thinking that that could cause, I guess they thought that was like some kind of like genetic defect that could cause like somebody to have homosexual motivation and cause like hormones to be all over the place. So yeah, I'm like, that's a stretch.
Oh, bloody
And of
hell.
course I didn't have it. But they just thought it was odd that like I was 12 and they're like little girls don't talk like that, that's abnormal, you need to look into that. So it got tested in October 2007, December of '08, and again one last time in March 2010, which really is not that long ago that they were giving me blood tests. And I'll just never forget how dehumanized they felt, not just getting the needles, but they were coming in with clipboards and white doctors just examining my body, like checking my hairline, like yeah, no, I'm just what is happening. But eventually, like, we're not seeing anything. That's just how he is.
But that's part of a really ingrained systemic belief that
Mm-hmm.
anything other, and this is a topic we'll come back to in a little bit, but
Mm-hmm.
anything other needs to be cured,
Yes. Yeah.
not understood, not necessarily supported, but that's sort of the knee jerk reaction is how can we cure that for you?
Right. Yeah. That's a really good point because even as like little kids, they do that. I mean, even like I mentioned earlier, and I think in Boston, I'm autistic, so I was in IEPs as very young, and even like as young as like 3 years old in nursery school. When they saw that I was hanging with the boys too much, they're like, "Nope, you got to separate them. He needs to be with the girls. He's not going to socially develop properly if he's hanging with the boys." It's like, they say that trans people are obsessed with gender, but I think to be honest, it's the opposite way of who's really enforcing these gender roles. So ultimately, I was just wrestling back and forth of what do I do? Because I didn't know what was going to happen. I was actually going to reunite for the very first time with my biological family ever that month of August of 2017, the same month that I was outed, the same month that all this was going on.
Right.
And so I was like, all right, now I have to make a decision. Like, am I going to go to Paraguay, visibly queer, which is a very big decision, and have them know me as Mateo, because my biological mother at the time was diagnosed with ovarian cancer, and we weren't sure what direction that was going to go in. So I'm like, okay, like I had to make a big decision there. I didn't want to go shock her, but also I kind of wanted to know, like, is she going to accept me? It was a very big deal for me. But then what ended up happening was Charlottesville, Virginia. The whole
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Jews will not replace us. Whole
Right.
these awful temper tantrum they had, where it was extremely violent over the statues being taken down, result in so much like violence. And needless to say, white supremacy is not new, in the United States by any means. But I think it was one of the first blatantly overt, once we saw it as overt for a long period of time, that was televised. Because usually we had like things that were like kind of sporadic pieces of violence up to 2016, but I feel like that was a different, where like for 2017, that incident was like televised for a long time. There was KKK standing there for like hours, and all these people kept coming in, and a woman died. It was like a whole thing that I think that was like alarming to everybody. It's like, this is getting really out of control. So that's what I remember seeing a video because I was watching it live because there's so many lives going on Facebook that day. And I was mortified, but I saw that there was a big group of trans people. I'm so mad I couldn't find the video ever again. I don't know if somebody removed it for safety, but and they were standing right in front of the Ku Klux Klan and they were getting yelled at all these horrible slurs, but they didn't back down. They did not back down. They formed like a whole like ring around them. And I was just so in awe of them, of how that they were just not willing to back down. They like formed a ring around the community, that people that are being more targeted. And just that resistance made me realize, like, you know what, like I'm trans. I'm part of this community, and yes, there's oppression, but there's been a lot of resistance since the beginning of the time,
Right. Right.
and it's ultimately I can be part of the story of resistance, and I can't do it from in the closet.
Speaking of resistance, let me turn back the clock a little bit. It's October of 2018. The Federalist Society, which is a conservative group of attorneys, the Boston chapter of that, was having a meeting. But Attorney General Jeff Sessions was speaking. His speech was interrupted 3 times, twice by pastors who
Mm-hmm.
were upset about the 45th president's immigration policy. And then there was a third time that Sessions was interrupted. Now, should be said that each of these interruptions was booed down by the group of conservative attorneys in the room. So
Mm-hmm.
each of these 3 protesters was booed down and escorted from the room. Tell me about the third protester.
Love that intro. So the third protester, surprise, surprise, was me. So I planned it the night before. I got a whole MAGA hat, which was terrible. I did not like wearing it. It felt very gross even having to wear it. But I wore it because I'm thinking, like, listen, I'm aware of how I look. I wasn't prety at that point, but even just me with my presentation of my race, I didn't, would be enough to give me a way of like, going to a very white room. So it had to kind of get something that made me look a little less suspicious. So I wore it in there, and table full of like all these white men talking about like being like of course, anti-abortion and all these gross things being said. Because there was a whole luncheon before Sessions was talking about Alabama baseball, and I was like, please get me out of here. Like, this is hell. I'm in hell right now. I'm in hell. I have to listen to all these conservative white men talk about things they think are so great. So finally, he went and gave like this awful speech about like, he called it like the freedom of religious liberty, but every queer person knows what that means. And at the very end, I ripped out the trans flag from my shoe and I wrote not erased on it, and I held it up and was kept yelling, "Will not be erased," because it was only days before he came to Boston, where he released actually one of the first, if not one of maybe the first aggressive trans legislations we've seen in recent years about defining us out of existence.
Mm-hmm.
So that's why I was yelling, "We will not be erased. We will not be erased." What did frustrate me was, but I'm not surprised at all, was the Christian pastors, even though they were heavily booed and got a lot of disrespect, were walked out of the room, not a hand on them. Even one of the same people that were awful to me directed the pastors to the elevator and said, "Pastor," like dressing them with their hands, and escorted them out. With me, I left with 3 sprains from Boston police.
Mm.
And with an aggressive crowd yelling all these awful things. Do I have regrets? Absolutely not. I came in there knowing I was going to stand up for the trans community. I did not want this clown coming to Boston and the trans community thinking nobody challenged him. There were protesters that were outside, but I really wanted Sessions to see somebody from the community inside. Because Sessions, I think, gets really comfortable when he doesn't see anybody that he's directly legislating against. But he said some pretty sinister, let's understand, very sinister policies. And the photo of it was actually pretty chilling because he's smiling in the background as I'm like yelling. So he knows exactly what he was doing with those policies.
Yeah.
Um,
We should
but no,
maybe
it
we should
was,
talk about that a little bit, Matteo, because I think if you aren't trans, you might not have been paying attention to what 45 and his administration were doing to trans people.
mm,
At least 9 or 10 government agencies rolled back protections for trans people under 45. Department of Agriculture, Education, Health and Human Services, Homeland Security, Housing and Urban Development, Justice,
mm-hmm,
Labor, Veterans Affairs, all rolled back Obama era protections in the Affordable Care Act.
yeah,
The Sessions office made it very clear that Title IX does not apply
yes,
to trans people and that there are no
mm-hmm,
protections there. And therefore, in fact, you're in Massachusetts, I'm in Connecticut. Sessions made it clear that if Connecticut continued to allow trans teen athletes to perform in their chosen gender, that he would cut off they would cut off funding. So it was systematic. It started. Now you've got me rolling. Sorry. I mean, it
no,
started.
please, yeah, it's been going for a while.
Yeah, it started on day one, on inauguration day.
It was the website, right? They took it off
Yes.
yeah, it was, they literally within hours of his inauguration, they took off the LGBT section, right, of the White House page. So I get really frustrated, especially when Sis Sally's like, "This is all new. Let's just all start in 2021." I'm like, you have not been paying attention, and we've
Yeah.
been telling you this for a long time. Sessions got as much attention as he did in 2018 because he tried to define trans people out of existence. That was like the larger, wide spectrum. That's why he got a lot of national attention. But no, the bathroom stuff, all of the stuff that you mentioned was way before 2018.
Yeah, and that's just a sliver. If you go to the National Center for Transgender Equality, there
Mm-hmm.
are 7 or 8 pages of initiatives by 45's administration that are specifically geared to rescinding rights about trans people that they pushed through at every level and in every department. So
Yeah.
it was part of a concerted attack to erase
Mm-hmm.
us. And hence your writing on the flag, not erased.
Mm-hmm. They've been trying for a while, but we're not going anywhere. It's never erased us. We've always been here as long as history of time.
It is not new. It's been around forever. It's just that it's been kept out of the conversation.
Exactly. And we have to be mindful too that it's been legally withheld. I mean, even just being gay was illegal in the United States until 1967. So I think there's a lot of audacity for people to tell us we're new when we've been illegal to exist as we are
Right?
until the 60s and 70s.
You said you work in education.
Yes.
That
Mhm.
has specifically been an area where employment was denied, and
Mhm.
strongly so, to anybody who's queer.
Absolutely, for sure. And I think that even on larger scales too. I mean, keep in mind I'm Jewish, and so I think that people are familiar with the famous picture of the Nazis standing in a circle and burning books.
Mm-hmm.
What I think people don't know is what specifically which books they were burning. Are you familiar with what book they were burning?
No.
It was books from literally about transgender hormones and transgender care.
Oh, wow. Magnus
Yep, they
Hirschfeld
took it from
and
one of the yep, they are, I forget, I'm ashamed right now at the moment, I don't remember the name of the institution, but it was in Germany. They had one of the strongest trans communities and one of the first gender affirming surgeries for particularly for trans women in the 30s. And they actually had a lot of research going on, and Nazis did not like that, needless to say.
right.
So they destroyed the whole building. They burned it down. They burned the books. So that particular photo of them standing there is throwing them is the books from that building. So a lot of the information about testosterone or HRT or about gender affirming care was like set back decades, particularly in Germany, because Nazis systemically got rid of it.
Wow.
So it was set back. So when we say it's new, it's like it's not new. It was just
Yeah.
intentionally gotten rid of.
Right. If you have one person with all the power, then you get the right to rewrite history and erase anything you don't like. It's what 1984 was all about.
Right, right. I mean, Bolsonaro, I mean, like Brazil has an amazing LGBTQ community, and Bolsonaro is like aggressively trying to go after it.
Mm-hmm.
Something that people have to be mindful of is information is when you pay for it, people aren't going to pay for it, but what's free? Stuff like Breitbart, things like Fox News stuff is going to be more accessible than if CNN and New York Times or the Globe or things like that. If that's going to be things you're paying for, people aren't going to pay for it. And what's more accessible? The nonsense, right? So I
Yeah.
think we have to make things more financially accessible for people to have access to information, and they'll see education about trans people. They'll see the truth about LGBTQ history. Yeah, but New York Times has been problematic recently, though. They've
Yeah.
posted some really sketchy things about trans people, like defending J.K. Rowling, who's been on a roll the past probably a
Yeah.
few decades.
That's terrifying. Yeah, I want to do an episode with people who are Potter fans and who were raised in and invested in the Potter universe, but have found this recent turn of events with the author to be upsetting. So if anybody's
Mm-hmm.
listening, I want to put that together. When we talk about gender dysphoria, we talk about a level of distress, of discomfort with the body, the physicality, and what we know is on the inside. Your dysphoria spreads into different areas because of something that I was saying to you, I tried to do a little research so I can discuss this intelligently with you, because of something called ciprotoxicity.
Mm.
Tell me about that in general first, and then we'll talk about your experiences.
So cyprotoxicity. Okay, so it's not just specific to Cipro, but I'll talk about it on a general scale first. What's important to know is that antibiotics, it's a type of antibiotic, but there's many different types of antibiotics in general, but there's different classes. And the most powerful class of antibiotics is called fluoroquinolones. You can call them FQ for short, so FQ antibiotics. They come with severe, very serious black box warnings on them. Before anybody goes, Mateo, there's side effects with any medication. And you might be biased because you've gone through it. No, I've done my research, and it's not like necessarily skewed by my experience. Like I want to make sure I'm giving proper information when I've given talks about this, when I've done presentations on this. I want to make sure that I'm not being influenced by my own experiences. It is the by far the most dangerous and risky ones, which is why the FDA has stepped in and said in 2016 they gave a warning: do not give this anymore for UTIs or any other simple infection before trying other alternatives. So I'm not in any way anti-medication. Like if you have an infection, go to your doctor, listen to your doctor. I just want to make sure I'm clear that I'm not like coming on here spewing
Right.
any like
Right, right,
conspiracies.
right.
What's important to understand though is a lot of medical professionals are not aware about these black box warnings because there's just been so many in the past few years that actually are so recent that I think that I really wish doctors were like in some ways were enforced to like take a class on like updated black box warnings every few years. I think that would actually help protect the doctor and the patient. But FQ antibiotics can come with tendon ruptures, neurological damage, muscle weakness, paralysis, blindness. I mean, there's just so many different things going on because it causes mitochondrial dysfunction. What do you need to function is your mitochondria. Like that's a huge part. I mean, we all know that line from like our ninth grade biology class, right? Like
Right.
mitochondria is the powerhouse of the cell. So
Right.
if that's damaged and your mitochondrial DNA is not coming back the same, your body's reprogrammed to not function properly. So it really tends to mimic other diseases. Like so it will feel and look like rheumatoid arthritis. It will look and feel like lupus. It will look and feel like a lot of autoimmune diseases. So a lot of people who take it end up in wheelchairs. They'll end up in, like braces. And I've seen people who've had like severe hearing loss from it, going blind from it. I mean, there's just so many different things that can happen to your body. So what happened to me was I took it in September 2017. It was actually what I mentioned in January to you was that my transness and my experience with my disability was very much intertwined because I came out as trans 15 days before I became disabled from Cipro. So it was really awful. I went on that trip to Paraguay, and there's a traditional drink down there called tereré, or maybe some folks know it as yerba mate. And it's a lovely drink. I love it. But I made the mistake of just having water, 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 water without bringing bottled water. So I inevitably got the food poisoning down there.
Oh no.
So I came back and all those the fun symptoms, right? So I ended up going to the ER. I'm like, I need fluids. This is like out of control. Like I've been feeling sick for like 3 days. So I went to the ER. They gave me fluids, and they did the typical, the urine tests, and they came back and like, oh, it looks like you have a UTI. So we're gonna give you an antibiotic. And they said, literally told me, it's a very powerful antibiotic. I wouldn't be surprised if your infection's gone even in a day or two. Now, back then, I knew nothing about classes of antibiotics. I just thought they were all the same. Like, and I thought this is a great thing. Like, yeah, give me, this is great. Give me a powerful one. And I was not warned about any of the black box warnings. And so I really wish I was told and that I could make an informed decision. So I could have taken, an antibiotic that would have helped, but one that wasn't as strong or dangerous. And that was not given for because that one already was limited. You're not the FDA says don't give this for UTIs, and they gave me for a
For UTI.
UTI.
And that,
Yeah,
but when they say that this is so strong it's going to knock out your infection in a couple of days, how would that not be appealing?
right. I know exactly. So within 2 weeks, it started with me just thinking like, oh, maybe I slept wrong, but I started feeling really severe pain in my arm and in my neck. So I was like, okay, this is weird. Then the next day, and the other one, I'm like, okay, this is symmetrical. This is weird. I'm wondering if I'm sleeping weird. But then it spread to my leg. I'm thinking like, all right, I'm gonna see a doctor. This is weird. I started having these bumps because the tendonitis was just so severe. And inevitably tendon ruptures, and like that's wild to have like a medication like rupture your tendons. But at first I didn't know what was going on. I was like, this is really bizarre. It just felt like my body was laying under a sewing machine. The peripheral neuropathy started, and I cannot describe how painful peripheral neuropathy is, especially when I didn't know the name for it yet. I couldn't extend my arms out fully yet. I couldn't move my fingers properly. This
So
is back when I
this is nerve damage that
this
we're
is
talking
nerve
about?
damage and nerve
Okay.
death. Yeah. Yeah. I've been in a wheelchair ever since. It just the amount of damage it caused to my body. So I actually just got a new job. I started my new career because I was freshly out of college. I was like 3 months graduated. So I was just starting out my life. I was just about to start moving and, life was just beginning. I was just starting to live my life as a man too, out as. So um, there was a lot of changes going on and a lot of arguments going on too about my gender with my parents at the same time as I was becoming partially paralyzed. So it was a very intense time in September and October of 2017, but it was just debilitating. It was just absolutely debilitating. I can never fully describe how bad it was, of just how long it would take me just to shift positions in my bed. Work became unsustainable because I couldn't function. Yeah.
You've put a very powerful video on your YouTube channel
Yes.
that
Yeah.
had me in tears at one point, which I think does a great job of showing not only the physical changes that this wrought, but the psychological, the emotional. There are moments when, and this is kind of what I want us to get to, is so as these physical changes are happening to you, you have to deal with that on the inside. And
Mhm.
it's that relationship between the you that you know you are and the reality of what your body can and can't do. So you're in a wheelchair. The braces, the leg braces, are you still wearing those?
Yep. So I have now I have KAFO leg braces, which are like, think about like the big ones from Forrest Gump,
Oh,
that
okay.
movie. If you've seen it, think
Yep.
about those type of braces. That's the type I have. But in the beginning, it was just like I had so many more like smaller braces, and I kept layering them because it was just unreal. I kept getting another one, another one, another one, because I just felt like my body was falling apart. I just needed to hold it together just to function. But yeah, it was psychological warfare. I mean, I can't describe how it is just to within 2 weeks have the life you knew at 20 for 22 years just slip right through you. Because keep in mind, I was very athletic, especially growing up as somebody who was transmasculine. That's the only place I really felt socially I thrived and
Mm-hmm.
that I did really well on was on the field, right? Like I couldn't do the frilly frou frou stuff and fit in with the girls anywhere else, but like I could very well on the field. So when I couldn't do the athletic things, and I couldn't really have the energy to socialize with people anymore, and all I could do was work, and even when that became unsustainable and things were just getting really difficult, and I realized that I couldn't do the job anymore, that was really heart wrenching for me, and more so than I think people realized because when I was growing up, after a lot of bullying happened for me being bi, and I was hospitalized 41 times in my adolescence for suicide attempts, for being bi, the whole, it was like
Mm-hmm.
all this was terrible. So, as an adolescent, I promised myself, like, I'm going to go to college someday and I'm going to be a counselor and I'm going to come out on the other side. So imagine going to college for 4 years. You got the job finally the same month, you become paralyzed from an antibiotic for something that wasn't supposed to be given to you, for something that has countless black box warnings on it that should have been screaming when the pharmacist gave it to you. Don't give this, and they gave it to you. The whole thing was just so preventable, which makes me so mad about it. And then just to have like your dream job just like that go, because
Yeah.
5 months in, I had to resign because as much as I adored all the students, they were wonderful. They were such a cool group. I was like, I'm gonna get in their way. I'm holding them back because I'm not.
What
I
age
can't
group are
provide
you
for them the
talking
way I
about?
want. They were like late high school at 22. I missed them, and I told them I had to leave, and they cried, and I
Mm.
cried. It was a really emotional thing when we all had to say bye because we were attached to each other. I was like, no.
Oh.
But then the whole war for that for survival began after that because I went on SSI, and SSI in Massachusetts is brutal. I was surviving on $644 a month, and so after all my bills were paid, I had $4 of spending money. No, it's not an exaggeration. Yeah, no, it was
Oh.
excruciating. So $4 of spending money, and what do you do with $4? I mean, you can't even buy anything. So I was miserable. I was bored to tears. I remember I literally, I'm trying to say this without crying because it was just such a bad time. I was pacing around my apartment as late as 2 to 4 in the morning, just pacing in circles because I just had nothing to do. I've read all the things in my room. I've watched I didn't have cable TV because I couldn't afford it. So I've watched all the shows on Netflix. I'm just like, I am so bored. I am so bored. I was like hitting myself because I was bored. I was so bored and so miserable and so much pain. I could not believe this had happened to me. And so it was just unreal what I was going through. And eventually, it can cause neurological damage and psychological damage, and it did. I started having hallucinations, and one of my friends realized that I was having like a lot of paranoia, so I went inpatient. And unfortunately, when you go into a hospital and you're trans and you have psychosis, that's also like a double whammy because I think that's all connected. And
Right.
they weren't taking my gender seriously, so I was getting dead named a lot. They thought my situation with Cipro was a hallucination, so they were denying me access to my braces and my wheelchair, so I couldn't walk very well. I mean, the whole thing was terrible. And eventually, a month later, all of this was like my nerve. In this period of time, my nerves were still dying, but it was a month later when the paralysis like finally like struck. I remember that moment when it finally like, yeah, I can't describe how it felt, but it was just like the worst pain I felt. And that was it. That's when I needed the KFO braces because yeah, it was done. My legs were toast. So
And vision also became a
yeah,
problem for you, right?
yeah. So that was after after I resigned from my job. It was like a month right after I was driving, and things just started to get like really blurry. And I was like, okay, so I started pulling over, and I just had this pit feeling in my stomach, and just sitting there like around midnight. I'm just like, something's wrong. Because it was like the same feeling I had back in September of that year when something was first wrong. It was like something's wrong. And so it was just like September 2017 again. I would be crying, everywhere I was driving, like, "So what's happening to me? What's happening to me?" And pull over again. And eventually, in May of the following month, I was just sitting there. My vision just went like totally warped. So I called a friend. Luckily, thank God for Siri. Siri can make calls. You don't have to see.
Right.
We also had Cipro poisoning. I was at this point, I was in survivors group, and they were like a huge support to me. And just said, "Hey, just so you know, Cipro can cause retinal tears, and it can cause you to go blind. It causes all kind of vision. It can cause like vision loss, like glaucoma. Like you got to go to the hospital and make sure there's no emergency going on." So I went. Luckily, they said my retinas were fine, but they did have me go to an optometrist, and they said it was neuropathy of the eyes. So it was just like my nerves in the eyes were just going too. So it was just like a brutal time. And at this point, like I had one friend pass away that year. I had another friend that was actively dying. So everything was just like around me was just loss, 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 loss. I got a note on my door from my landlord saying, "Hey, we're raising the rent from 1622 to 1751." And everybody's like, when I talked to my roommate, I'm like, "I can't afford another dollar of this place." So we split up and I had no idea where I was going to go
Mm.
because now I was in a wheelchair. So I had to consider accessibility.
Right.
So it was hard. And I was also still very visibly trans. So it made things a lot harder for me to find a place because nobody was answering my calls. My voice is very high, but I had a very masculine name.
Right.
So these things were very hard. It was very hard. I do not know how I got through. Like 2017 to 2020 was a very brutal, brutal time.
Which
Um,
is again a period in which we as a country were just marinating in daily awful messages on
yeah,
all fronts. What did you hold on to, Mateo? What got you through day to day?
community. I was very blessed that I had enough strength at times to be able to go to protests, and I actually started going to protests a lot because now that it wasn't working 9 to 5, now that I just saw so much horrible news. Because again, I was watching the news all the time. And it would be some kind of incident. It was like days without an incident, none. Because you're right, we were marinating terrible shit. Luckily Boston was like having protests like every day for something out there. So I was constantly going to Boston because I had nothing else to do. And luckily by then I had a power wheelchair because I couldn't push myself in a manual wheelchair anymore. So I
Mm.
did a GoFundMe, which SSI punished me for, by the way, which I was really pissed about. They like penalized me for it. They're like, we saw money in your bank account. Even though I proved like by printing out and mailing it to them, like highlighting exactly how much money I got from everybody, they're like, well, that still counts against you. So we're gonna take money away from your check until it's owed
Oh,
back. I was really pissed, but either way, I had my power wheelchair from GoFundMe, so that like enabled me to go out in the community again. Like accessibility is huge when you get a motor wheelchair. So I was marching out with people, and I was like, going to people's houses again, and life started coming back into me. It wasn't just rotting away in my apartment and miserable and not seeing anybody and staring at bare walls.
mm.
So now, like fast forward to like end of 2018, 2019, like that's how I could do the Jeff Sessions things. I had my power wheelchair. I was like flying in, flying out. So I was able to build community. I was with Cosecha. I was with Never Again Action, doing smaller, smaller things but powerful things, joining different fellowships. So even if it was like virtual or if it was in person. So it's been a long, brutal 6 years, but I've really been blessed with like so many people I can call upon either to vent or to go hang out with or go celebrate with. There's always something to go seek joy with. So that's really what's held me together is that I'm never short of somebody to go call upon.
If you don't want to talk about this, just let me know. But is this a degenerative thing, or is it sort of those are the symptoms you experienced, and that's your new reality?
Unfortunately, it is. Mitochondrial stuff does not, like, once that's damaged, that's damaged. There is, though, finally, there is a lot of studying going towards it. I think because there's been a lot more publicity towards it in recent years. Like this has been a thing since it was created. Like Cipro's been around since 1987. There's been fluoroquinolones around since like the 50s. But even like there was a celebrity that died from it yesterday. Bobby Caldwell. He wrote "What You Won't Do for Love." Yeah, he's a more of an older one, but he died at age 71. But he died from what I have, and so it was on USA Today and a lot of different news yesterday. So I'm like, now that like CNN's talking about it, I'm like, hopefully, as terrible as this is,
Yeah.
it's got to get more people talking about it. But there is more research going towards it now. So I think that, like for example, there's now a regenerative medicine center in LA that like specifically is dealing with cyprotoxicity and fluoroquinolone toxicity. And like there's a gentleman who was a doctor actually who got it, and he tells his story all the time. He's like, no, I'm figuring stuff out, and we're not. People aren't like necessarily inherently going to die from it, right? But we're starting to figure out like if we can fix the mitochondria, maybe we can make people feel better and not just have this be a gradual decline. So I'm hoping that someday, I can't imagine myself running 8 miles a day, right? But I'm hoping that it won't feel as miserable because I mean, it's really just destroyed my bodies in so many ways that I won't even talk about here, but
Yeah.
it's a lot. But yeah, having to use a white cane like was shocking for me when I had to like use that for the first time because like my vision was getting bad enough where I was like flying off of curbs,
Yeah,
or
that's
when
not
I'd be in
good.
the grocery store and I'd like accidentally like walk into people, especially during COVID. That was the worst because like my peripheral vision's dark now. So like I'd be like bumping into people in COVID. Everybody's like, yeah, have social distancing. Give me a break.
And
You know?
in Boston, I met your support animal, whose name I've
Yes,
already
Tilly's
forgotten.
one.
I'm so sorry.
Tilly, yes,
Tilly,
she's a service dog.
gorgeous animal.
Yes, she has literally saved my life because I got her. It was the Pride Parade in 2019, and I saw these really cute dogs. They were like dressed up in all this Pride stuff, and it was like the coolest thing. So I walked up to them, like go take pictures of them, and I saw that they had some service dog stuff on, so I backed away because I'm like, oh, I want to respect them. I didn't know they were service dogs. And the woman looks up at me and she goes like, "You looking for a service dog?" Like at first I was like, this is a scam. Like this is not how this shit works. Like usually it's a long, extensive, brutal process, right? Because I know I've always wanted a service dog, but like I know it's impossible to get one financially. Like I said, I can barely afford shit. Now I have a part-time job because I SSD I was messing with me so badly I had no choice but to get a part-time job. Even if I just work 2 days a week, it drastically impacts my ability to like afford things. Thank God I can like
Hmm.
eat out. I mean, it really makes a big difference, even just working 2 days a week. But still, I was like, I can't, in 2 days a week, I can't afford paying for like a $7,000 dog. But she goes like, well, we have this dog named Tilly, and like Tilly wasn't there, but like she showed me a picture, and a woman who is a breeder said she had too many puppies, so she donated a few dogs to us and she said she wanted us to train them for a few years, and when it was ready, that we'd give it to somebody who couldn't afford it. I'm like, wow, I feel like this like universe speaking to me, like. And so we exchanged numbers right there, and she was serious. She's like, "Yeah, no, this woman and I have been friends for a while," and she was adamant. She's like, "We know that it can be really inaccessible for people, to have service dogs, so it's a very rare opportunity." But she's like, "I still have to screen you, though. I still need all the paperwork from your doctor. I still, need to do that regular process, making sure that the dog bonds with you and that like Tilly's safe with you, and so she still was very thorough. It wasn't just like, here, take this.
Right.
So Tilly and I trained for a few weeks because Tilly was already fully trained and certified and all of that. We just wanted to make sure that Tilly was fit my needs well, and she did. The minute I met her, I'm like, just mine, you know.
Hmm.
So we trained for a month, and Tilly matched with me, and so I got her 1 month later. It was so cool. So, like I said, all three of my best friends passed away. But at this point, only two of them had passed, and I think they both saw just how badly I was suffering. At this point, because I was just so severely, severely depressed after they were passed. It was so bad. I could not get out of bed. Friends were lost at what to do with me because it would just be a beautiful day. It would be a beautiful day, and they could not get me out of bed. I remember there was like, some parties we would have like at the house, and they would have like random cookouts, and I would just be downstairs in bed, and they're like, "Come on, like have a hot dog, go outside. The kids are playing outside." And it's like, and I would just cry. I'm like, I can't today. So when I got Tilly, it was actually perfect because I had to. I mean, she needed to pee.
Yep.
Even just me having to go to pee at first, I was a little stubborn because, like, I mean, I have to, so I would, of course, like without question, I would. But I was like, I mean, at first I was grumpy about it, but eventually I was like, actually, like, it is a beautiful day. And then eventually I was like, how do I walk her? I'm in a wheelchair. I'm like, oh wait, I can tie her to my power chair. So I was walking her and I was getting fresh air and I was getting sunshine.
Yeah.
And it was so good for my mental health because then I was seeing people again. I was like seeing neighbors. I was seeing nature. So it got me out. So Tilly's been wonderful to really help me heal. I walk her actually pretty consistently around where one of my friends is buried. So on Fridays, like when it's really warm out in the spring and summer, that's like our thing. We'll go to the grave where our friend's buried, who I think brought her to me. Like we'll go
Mm.
get an ice cream, we'll go get a sandwich, we'll go hang with Lindsay for a bit, and I'll be like, hey, like go say hi to a friend. I know that she brought you to me. So
Yeah.
we'll walk around and just it's a really beautiful place. So
I'm so happy to
yeah,
hear that.
Tilly's definitely saved me for sure. Because I was just oof. And then when the third friend passed away, like that was like where my soul was just ripped. And I just remember like telling everybody, like, if I did not have Tilly, if I literally did not have Tilly, this would be it. Like I would not couldn't live another day. So Tilly's literally been my lifeline in many ways.
One last question, if I could.
Of course.
In terms of the similarities between being trans and being disabled, is that the correct
Yep.
adjective? Okay.
Yep.
I have been finding that a lot of well intentioned people who don't want to say anything hurtful and they just aren't sure what to say and they're a little bit intimidated by that. I don't want to say the wrong pronouns. I don't want to use the wrong name. What if I say something that's offensive? And they just don't know how to talk to a trans person. I'm just going to speak for myself here. I find myself in that same situation when I'm interacting with someone in a wheelchair.
Mm.
I want to do the right thing. I want to say the right thing. The last thing I want is for somebody to come away from that interaction feeling like I didn't see them or I didn't respect.
Mhm.
So, since there is a height situation, what's the right protocol? What would you want people to do and say, and what should people never do and say?
Gotcha. I know there's a lot. So I'm really glad you asked because I think it's important. I think people talk about a lot about different etiquette, but forget to ask about disability etiquette. And it's important because sometimes people can really piss me off and don't realize that they really piss me off. So I'm glad you asked. So yeah, do not crouch to talk to us. It feels condescending and makes us feel like we're little kids. Sometimes I've seen people do disability trainings and like they'll say, "Oh yeah, crouch down to a wheelchair user. It's more respectful because you're making eye contact." Like, no, it makes me feel like I'm a little kid. Like I know people might think because you're standing up and you're looking down, you might feel like you're looking down on me, but we're so used to it that it just I don't even think twice about it because it's literally we're always looking up at everything. It really to us it feels like we're just short, so
Because I
it doesn't.
would make that mistake. Eye to eye contact is
Yeah.
something as a former teacher that,
Right.
that's
No, you're
how the
still making eye
communication
contact with us.
happens.
It just imagine just looking at a short person. That's literally what it is.
Gotcha.
It's like
Okay.
if you wouldn't crouch down to a short person and do that because that would be disrespectful. So like
Right.
same thing with that. If they did, I think you're good.
Yeah. And I think that's part of it. I don't want to get punched, really. That's my goal in any social situation.
Definitely don't put your clothes on. It just happens to me and it pisses me off. Don't put your clothes on your wheel on a wheelchair without asking, or usually it's chair with it because it's our wheelchair is like an extension of our body. So it's kind of like the equivalent if somebody just came and like hung up clothes on you. It would feel like, hey, this isn't like a chair, like this is my
Oh,
body.
wow.
People have done that, or like same thing, like don't rest your arm on it. Like sometimes I've been in the elevator and people will just be like, they'll take their arm and put it on me. I'm like, because the thing is, people have to remember we're in this all day, and so like this moves with me. So it literally is the equivalent of somebody putting like their hand on my shoulder, the hand on my head. It literally feels the same. So yeah, it's not comfortable. This should be obvious, but don't move us. It's happened to me so many times where like it's appalling. It's appalling. And I think that knowing you and just how wonderful you are, I think you would know that. But for listeners, it's
But
important to
for
know
yeah,
this.
for well, hey, thank you for thinking I'm wonderful. But
Yeah,
uh,
but I'm
but
not
in
worried about
terms of
you. But
that, are they doing it out of a desire to help, or let's get you out of my way because I need to get to the cereal
I've
aisle?
I've seen a mixture of both. I've seen
Oh,
sometimes people not ask and be like, "Oh, I got this," freaking, and they'll move me, and I'm like, "No, I can move myself, but thank you," because it feels infantilizing when they do it out of trying to help, but also I don't think people realize that wheelchair users know how to move our chairs in really specific ways to angle ourselves. So sometimes it takes more work for us to correct our position if somebody just like messes up like our angle. It's like, wait, now I have to reposition myself and then like do it this way. It's like it just makes more work for us when people like mess with our chairs, even if they're trying to help. Same thing with not touching our wheelchairs. Like if like we're putting it in the car, like don't touch it without our consent. Because I've had people like mean really well. If I'll turn around, they're like trying to take apart my wheelchair. I'm like, no, you're not doing it right. You're gonna break it. And they're like, oh, you're not. Like, no, I understand that. But like, you'd see if you pulled that even higher, like you gotta break it. Then I had to take it to insurance. So like, just make sure you ask because we understand like good intention, but if the impact is going to be more of a pain or more work for us, then it's going to be more aggravating. But I have seen people mean it like in a rude way too, where like I literally was at an event, and this is bad because this is like a protest too. I was like, I guess like in this guy's way, he turned my wheelchair on, like literally pressed the button and
oh my
moved my
God!
joystick to me. And
Whoa!
I looked up, yo, he's so lucky he didn't get punched. It was in public, and I was like on a stage. I couldn't like deck him. But like
Wow!
I literally looked up at him like, "What are you doing?" And he goes, "Oh, I just needed to get by." I'm like, "Then ask me." Be mindful that like it's really an extension of our body, so just treat it as if it was your feet or your legs. Just you wouldn't hang up clothes, you wouldn't pick up and move somebody. So you
R-
same thing with us. Like don't just like wheel us away.
right,
You know?
right.
Yeah, I mean it comes down to autonomy, right? Like if we say no, we don't need help, then trust us. Like don't be like, "Are you sure? Are you sure? Are you sure?" Because it's like annoying for us. It's like, yes, it's fine. I can get my own coffee. Because then we feel individualized. It's like, all right. Because I remember I was at an event where like that happened. They kept asking. I know they meant well, but after a while, it's like, I really can reach it. It's fine. Do not pet us. Do
Oh,
not
good
pet us.
God!
Do not pet us. I've got pet so many times. You're like, hi, buddy. Yep, do not call us buddy. I mean, talk to us like we're adults. Adult, no sing-song voice, even if they have an intellectual disability as well. Do not use a sing-song voice. If they are an adult, talk to them like an adult. Yeah, I feel like people just tend to infantilize disabled adults a lot. And I think it really just, I mean, I've been to events too where I be very careful. And I really recommend just steering away from it altogether, is just not asking what put the person in a wheelchair,
Okay.
because I think people sometimes mean well, thinking like, oh, it's gonna be a conversation starter, but you really don't know. It could really trigger somebody if it was like a car accident. Because to be honest, if I'm hanging out at an event or having a great time, I don't. That's the time I don't want to think about it,
Right.
because this actually happened a few times where people have come up and like asked me really invasive questions, and some of my friends are kind of dismissive. They meant well, but they're like, oh, you don't have to answer him. And I'm just like, it doesn't matter that I don't have to answer him. Now I'm thinking about it, and I
Right.
didn't want to think about it, because like it's enough to put me in the dumps. Because for me, I feel like I should tell people about it, because like, well, I mean, it could happen to them. It's not like I have something genetic where like, okay, it happened. Like I feel like this is something I do have to answer to people. So I think it's good just to steer away from it, because sometimes people are open about it, but like let them tell you like on their terms when they're ready.
Which brings us back to the trans thing, right? That people
Yes.
see someone, they clock them as trans, and even if the intentions are good, there's that curiosity and, oh, I want to know about this and I want to know about that, and pretty soon you're
Yeah.
invading things that really are none of
Mhm.
your business. Anything else we should talk about before we go?
I think I don't think I think we covered each. The only thing we really didn't go so much into is dealing with being a trans person and a disabled person when you deal with medical professionals. But I think that's,
Oh,
they go to the extent of like pronouns, but it's like that's really basic bare minimum. And they seem to really not really know what like trans people are or what they really look like, because they kind of assume that we're just the stereotype, and then they like once they actually see us in their office, they don't get it. Yeah, having that intersection is something that always scares me when I go into a doctor's office, and something that I do, especially as somebody who's a person of color. It's heartbreaking that I've had to do this, but this is something that I actually do. I'll give you an example. Is back in November, I was meeting with a specialist, and it was like a really like cold, windy day. So I had sweatpants on, I had a hoodie, and I walked outside about to go to my doctor's appointment. And then like I saw myself in the mirror on the way out. I'm like, shit, I can't wear this. So I went back and I changed, and I wore like I had jeans on, so I didn't look like super dressed up. But then I wore a tie and I wore a jacket. And then I went to the doctor's appointment. Why did I do that? Because they'll take me more seriously. Because if you're a person of color and you're trans and you're disabled, I unfortunately have to lean into respectability politics, because if you go in there wearing a hoodie, you look, they're gonna see me as somebody who's not educated, or they're not gonna take me seriously. So it's unfortunate that I have to do that when I go to doctor's appointments. I have to wear a tie and I just want to be comfortable. So it's something that the reality that we have to do, and that I feel like I have to waste my time educating doctors, not just about the fact of what I deal with as somebody who deals with a medical error. I mean, that's a whole other level of what I have to go in, because it's like, okay, I became disabled from medical errors. Like my favorite example that I dealt with, I got COVID, like the OG COVID, like severe COVID back, but like we're talking like the OG, like spring 2020. Because I work in assisted living, and it was really horrific. We lost 26 residents in 2020, and so it was only inevitable I was eventually going to get it. And it triggered, obviously, I had already underlying pre-existing conditions, and so I lost the ability to walk completely. And my left hand completely paralyzed. I'm a lefty, so I was out of work for 3 months. Spent the summer of 2020 relearning how to walk. I was in the hospital for 16 days. I was struggling to breathe. It was terrible. I had to call 911 because I couldn't breathe. But they were just so nasty about me being trans when I was there. It was like an obsession to them, and it was like scary for me, because I was like, you guys are like obsessed with this. They came in and they're like, so we see that you are transsexual. I'm like, oh God. But we're going like three DSMs back, if you're using that word. So we want to know, when did you come out as transsexual? I'm like, oh God. I said, so September, well, I said August 2017. I'm like, okay. And when did you said that you were poisoned by Cipro a month later? I'm like, yes. Like, okay, well, I think that all of this, and the reason why your COVID was so bad and your response was so bad, was not because of Cipro. And I'm like, okay, what does that have to do with anything now? Like, I think it's because you're transsexual and you didn't go to gender therapy. I know.
whoa.
And so I was really pissed. COVID just like totally like destroyed my body. because they said, "Oh, your blood tests are normal," but I checked my portal and they were not normal. It was more red than normal. You know how like things are marked up red on your test if they're wrong,
Right,
like if
right.
they're. And so I called my nurse and I was like, "Can you interpret these for me?" And she looked at these and she's like, "Yeah, like these are not normal." It's like, and so I eventually confronted them like, "Well, we weren't dishonest because on the paper it says this." I'm like, "No, you told me one thing. On paper it says this, so you technically are lying." So like, basically you're playing games, you're blaming that things are so bad for me right now, not just because of COVID, because they didn't want the narrative that my underlying conditions made this worse because of cipro. They wanted to take cipro out of the equation and just blame it on me being trans. I asked them like, "Are you guys do the test?" Like, "No, we canceled those, so we're gonna discharge you." And I'm like, "To where?" And they're like, "So we're just gonna have you have a home nurse, so you're gonna go home." So I contacted my roommates at the time, and they're like, "The landlord says that he doesn't want you to come back because now you're a liability, that you can't walk." So I had to go back to live with my homophobic parents for the summer of 2020. And so literally all the summer, I'd listen to Tucker Carlson
Oh
and
my
Fox News every
God.
day during the George Floyd protests. Like that was like the peak of everything in this little like beach house. It had no doors, so I was just listening to it. It was like psychological warfare because I couldn't get up and walk away from it. I was like, "This is terrible." Literally on the basis of them just being so obsessed with me being trans. I was like, "Listen, if I was cis, y'all would have been all over the paralysis shit."
I hate to leave it on an upsetting note.
No, it's okay. I
Uh,
think that people need to be aware of the level that people will take it to, the professionals will take it to. So I think if anything, is a learning moment for listeners to reflect that trans people will have a very different experience than cis people, and that we're not making it up when we say the gravity of what we really will go through. So I don't think it's a negative note. I think if anything, I hope there's something we can take from this, that like we listen to trans people and we tell you our experiences, that they're not some romanticized or exaggerated situations, and that you can show up in community and show up in allyship for us and listen to our stories and spread them.
This is Sadie McCarthy. I'm Claire's niece. Transqat is a production of Transqat Enterprises, LLC. Copyright 2022, all rights reserved. Join us on the web at transqat.com. That's TRANSQAT.com. There, you'll find links to Transqat, the blog, writing projects, speaking engagements, and more. You can also meet the team who thought spelling cat with a Q was a good idea. Follow Transqat on Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube. Leave us a comment on whatever platform you use to stream this podcast. Just remember to be kind. She has enough self-esteem problems already. To reach Claire with a question or a suggestion for an upcoming episode, just use the contact page at the website or email her directly at crmtranscat@gmail.com. Thanks for listening.